It was supposed to be a routine traffic stop. A young black man, calm and composed, pulled over on a quiet street, but the officer approaching him had something else in mind, a smirk of superiority and a chip on his shoulder. "License and registration," the officer barked, dripping with disdain. The man handed them over without a word, his steady gaze unwavering. The officer's tone grew sharper, more confrontational. But then, something shifted. The officer glanced at the name on the ID, and his face froze. A flicker of panic crossed his eyes. Why? What secret about this man would leave the officer scrambling? Stay tuned, because this story ends with a twist no one saw coming. Before we jump into today's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. If you love powerful stories of justice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so you never miss what's coming next. Now, let's get started. He wasn't the kind of man you'd notice in a crowd. Unassuming, dressed simply, with a quiet confidence that didn't need flashy displays. Marcus Daniels preferred it that way. As a high-ranking officer in internal affairs, he had learned the power of observation, the strength in silence. To most people, Marcus was just another face. To those who truly knew him, he was the kind of man who didn't speak unless it mattered. And when it did, his words could shake the very ground you stood on. But today, Marcus wasn't in his office with files and evidence spread before him. Today, he was on his way home, driving his modest car down an empty suburban street. He wasn't expecting trouble. Yet, trouble had a way of finding people like him. And as those flashing red and blue lights lit up his rearview mirror, Marcus knew this wasn't going to be a routine stop. What he didn't know yet was how deep this encounter would cut, or how far it would go to uncover the truth. The officer approached Marcus's car with slow, deliberate steps, his hand hovering near his holster. His gaze was sharp, predatory, like a man who had already made up his mind. "Roll down the window," he barked, his tone more command than request. Marcus complied, his face calm, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of weariness. He'd been here before, different town, different badge, same story. "License and registration," the officer demanded, not even glancing at Marcus as he spoke, as if looking him in the eye might shatter the power he thought he held. Marcus handed over the documents without a word. The officer scanned them quickly, but something in his expression hardened. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "This isn't exactly your side of town." There it was, the first crack in the facade, the unspoken accusation. Marcus knew better than to rise to the bait. "Just driving home," he said evenly. But the officer wasn't satisfied. He stepped back, hand on his radio, and called for backup. "Stay in the car," he ordered. Marcus's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, his calm exterior barely concealing the storm brewing inside. He knew where this was going. When the second patrol car arrived, the situation escalated fast. The officers began searching Marcus's vehicle without cause, their movements aggressive, their tone dripping with disdain. "What's a guy like you driving a car like this for?" one of them sneered. Marcus watched silently, his jaw clenched. They didn't know who he was, not yet. But their arrogance, their blatant disregard for protocol, was setting the stage for a confrontation they weren't prepared for. And as Marcus sat there, the weight of every injustice he'd ever faced pressing down on him, he made a decision. He wouldn't let this slide. Not today. Not ever. What the officers didn't realize was that their actions were digging a hole they'd never climb out of. And Marcus was about to show them just how deep it could go. The officer returned to Marcus's window, now flanked by his equally smug backup. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his voice dripping with authority he didn't deserve. Marcus raised an eyebrow but didn't protest. He knew the script they were following. Paint the man as a threat, escalate without cause, and hope the story ends quietly in their favor. But Marcus wasn't the kind of man to let their story take the spotlight. As he stepped out of the car, the officers immediately began their intimidation tactics. One patted him down unnecessarily, while the other circled him like a predator toying with its prey. "Got anything to hide?" one of them mocked. Marcus's silence seemed to irritate them more. "Not talking, huh? You think you're above us or something?" the first officer sneered, stepping closer. That's when Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady and cold. "You might want to think carefully about what you're doing here." The officer laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "Oh, yeah? And why's that?" Marcus took a step forward, his calm gaze locking onto the officer's startled eyes. "Because I'm Marcus Daniels, head of Internal Affairs." The weight of his words hit like a thunderclap. The officers froze, their arrogance replaced by a creeping sense of dread. For the first time, Marcus saw a flicker of doubt in their eyes. He let the silence stretch, his presence now commanding the space. "You know," Marcus continued, his tone razor-sharp, "I make it my business to root out exactly this kind of behavior, and you've just given me everything I need." The officers exchanged panicked glances, their bravado crumbling. Marcus wasn't just another target for their abuse of power. He was the very person who could dismantle their careers with a single report. But this wasn't over yet. Marcus wasn't here just to expose their misconduct. He was here to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. The silence between them was electric, charged with unspoken fear and dawning realization. Marcus took out his phone, his movements deliberate, and began recording. "Every word, every action. Let's make sure this moment is well documented," he said, his voice steady but laced with authority. The officers stammered, their confidence visibly shaken. "There's no need for that," the first officer said, his tone suddenly conciliatory. "This is just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his piercing gaze cutting through their excuses. "You called for backup without cause, searched my vehicle without consent, and subjected me to unnecessary force. That's not a misunderstanding. It's misconduct." As Marcus spoke, his phone buzzed with a text. It was from his assistant at Internal Affairs. The officers' badge numbers had already been flagged in previous complaints. Marcus's calm expression didn't falter, but inwardly the pieces were falling into place. These weren't just bad apples, they were habitual offenders. One of the officers, clearly panicking, tried to regain control. "Look, we can handle this like adults. No need to escalate things." But Marcus wasn't about to let them off the hook. "Oh, this isn't escalation. This is accountability," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut through their defenses. As Marcus continued gathering evidence, his mind raced through the stories he'd read in countless reports, the victims who never had the chance to stand up for themselves, the ones whose voices had been silenced by fear or force. Today wasn't just about him. It was about them. "Backup, huh?" Marcus said, breaking the tense silence. "Let's call for some real backup." He dialed a number, and within minutes a black unmarked car pulled up. Two officers from Internal Affairs stepped out, their presence sending a chill through the air. The tables had turned completely. But this was only the beginning. Marcus wasn't just here to expose them. He was about to uncover something much darker, something these officers had desperately tried to keep buried. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as the Internal Affairs officers approached. The patrol officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier arrogance now replaced with visible unease. Marcus handed his phone to one of the agents without breaking eye contact with the officer who had initiated the stop. "I trust you'll find this recording useful," he said calmly. The Internal Affairs officers exchanged a glance before one of them turned to Marcus. "Sir, you'll want to hear this," he said, holding up a tablet. The screen displayed a series of reports, a damning history tied to these very officers. Complaints of harassment, falsified reports, excessive force, names and dates laid bare for all to see. But that wasn't the worst of it. One file stood out, marked urgent. Marcus's sharp eyes scanned it quickly, his calm expression tightening. "You've been covering up for each other," he said, his voice colder than before. "Falsifying evidence, intimidating witnesses, and worse." The officers' faces turned pale. "I don't know what you're talking about," the lead officer stammered, his bravado now completely gone. Marcus stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "Don't you?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Because the evidence says otherwise. This isn't just misconduct, it's corruption, and it ends today." Suddenly, the internal affairs agents revealed the final piece of evidence, a body cam recording from one of the officers that they'd thought had been deleted. The footage showed an incident from weeks prior, the officers planting drugs in a suspect's car while laughing about how easy it was to ruin someone's life. The weight of the revelation hit the patrol officers like a sledgehammer. One of them tried to run, but an internal affairs agent blocked his path. "You're not going anywhere," the agent said firmly. Marcus turned back to the lead officer, his eyes blazing. "You thought you could abuse your power, hide behind the badge, and no one would notice. But you were wrong. I see everything." The sound of handcuffs clicking into place was deafening. But Marcus wasn't finished. "This isn't just about holding you accountable," he said, his voice echoing with resolve. "It's about sending a message. Justice isn't blind. It's watching." As the officers were led away, Marcus stood there, a storm of emotions swirling inside him. But he wasn't done yet. What came next would ensure the system could never shield people like them again. As the patrol cars drove off, their disgraced occupants in handcuffs, Marcus stood in the quiet street, his breath steady but his mind racing. This wasn't just about one traffic stop, one moment of injustice. It was about a broken system that needed fixing. And fixing it was exactly what he intended to do. Over the following weeks, the investigation into the officers' actions widened. Marcus led the charge, ensuring every detail was scrutinized, every victim's voice heard. Witnesses came forward, emboldened by the exposure of the officers' crimes. Cases once buried in fear began to see the light of day. The corrupt officers faced not just termination, but criminal charges. But Marcus knew their downfall wasn't enough. He pushed for systemic reforms, mandatory body cam audits, accountability protocols, and training programs designed to root out bias. When the changes were finally implemented, Marcus stood at the podium, addressing a room packed with reporters. His voice was calm, but his words were firm. "Justice isn't a privilege for the few, it's a right for everyone. And if we have to tear down broken systems to rebuild them stronger, then that's what we'll do." The story spread far beyond the town, resonating with people across the country. For many, Marcus became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming injustice, the truth could prevail. But for Marcus, it wasn't about fame or recognition. As he drove home that evening, the same quiet strength in his eyes, he reflected on the countless others who had suffered in silence. He carried their stories with him, a reminder that his fight was far from over. The morale was clear. Power is not in a badge or a title, but in the integrity of those who wield it. And when integrity stands tall, no injustice can stand against it. Thank you for watching. Maya's story reminds us that standing up for what's right can create lasting change. Whether it's overcoming adversity or challenging injustice, your voice matters. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment with your thoughts on the story. Let's keep this conversation going. And remember, sharing these stories helps spread the message of justice and fairness, one act of courage at a time. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today.